Friends, this is first question of our AZ-305 exam practice question series. You plan to deploy an Azure web app named EP1 that will use Microsoft Entra ID authentication. EP1 will be accessed from the internet by the users at your company. All the users have computers that run Windows 11 and are joined to Entra ID. You need to recommend a solution to ensure that the users can connect to App1 without being prompted for authentication and can access App1 only from company-owned computers. Make a note, they can only access it from company-owned computers. What should you recommend for each requirement? And the first requirement is the users can connect to App1 without being prompted for authentication. Your options are an Entra ID managed identity, an Entra ID app registration, Entra ID application proxy. And friends, to ensure that users can connect to App1 without being prompted for authentication, you should recommend an Entra ID app registration. By using an Entra ID app registration, you can configure single sign-on, which allows users to authenticate once and access multiple applications without being prompted for credentials again. Since the user's computers are already joined to Entra ID, they can leverage SSO for seamless access to App1. Now, the next requirement was the users can access App1 only from company-owned computers. Your options are Entra ID Administrative Unit, Azure Policy, Conditional Access Policy, Azure Application Gateway. And folks, to ensure users can access App1 only from company-owned computers, you should implement conditional access policies in Entra ID. This way, you can enforce policies that restrict access to App1 to devices that are marked as compliant or joined to the Entra ID. Let's look at next question. You have an Azure subscription that contains 300 virtual machines that run Windows Server 2022. You need to centrally monitor all warning events in the system logs of the virtual machines. What should you include in the solution? Now, your first part is resources to create in Azure. And your options are a storage account, a search service, an event hub, a log analytics workspace. Friends, things you would need to do to achieve the solution of central monitoring is to create a log analytics workspace. A log analytics workspace in Azure Monitor is the appropriate solution for collecting and analyzing data from multiple sources, including the system logs from virtual machines. By creating a log analytics workspace, you can configure the virtual machines to send their system logs to this workspace, where you can then query and monitor for warning events centrally. Now, the next part is configuration to perform on the virtual machines. What would you do on the virtual machines to achieve this configuration? And your options are configure continuous delivery, install the Azure Monitor agent, modify the membership of the event log readers group, create event subscriptions. And folks, the correct answer here would be to install the Azure Monitor agent on the virtual machines. Azure Monitor agent collects performance metrics, logs, and custom data from your virtual machines. Installing this agent is essential to gather the system logs and send them to the log analytics workspace. Now, the next step that you would follow in this setup would be to configure data collection to send the system logs to the log analytics workspace and then create queries and alerts within the log analytics workspace to monitor the warning events in the system logs. Next question. You plan to deploy an Azure SQL database that will store personally identifiable information, PII. You need to ensure that only privileged users can view the PII. What should you include in the solution? Your options are transparent data encryption, which is TDE, dynamic data masking, data discovery and classification, role-based access control, which is RBAC. You should include dynamic data masking in your solution to ensure that only privileged users can view personally identifiable information in Azure SQL database. Now, dynamic data masking helps prevent unauthorized access to sensitive data by enabling customers to designate how much of the sensitive data to reveal with minimal effect on application layer. It's a policy-based security feature that hides the sensitive data in the result set of an query over designated database fields, while the data in the database is not changed. Let's now look at why other options are incorrect. Now, option A, TDE encrypts the entire database at rest. It protects against unauthorized access to the physical files and helps secure the database from threats like disk theft. However, TDE does not control who can view the data once they have access to the database through legitimate means. Now, option C, data discovery and classification, is a tool for identifying and classifying sensitive data within your database. It helps you understand where your PII is located and categorize it appropriately. However, it doesn't enforce any access controls or masking on its own. Option D, role-based access control, is used to manage access at cloud plane level, folks. And here we are talking about access at data plane level. So again, an incorrect choice. Friends, I hope now you understand why option A, C, and D are incorrect. But if you still have any doubts, please post them in the comment section and I'll try to address them as soon as possible. Fourth question. You have an application that is used by 6,000 users to validate their vacation requests. The application manages its own credential store. Users must enter a username and password to access the application. The application does not support identity providers. You plan to upgrade the application to use single sign-on authentication by using a Microsoft Entra application registration. Which SSO method should you use? And your options are SAML, header-based, OpenID Connect, and password-based. Friends, key to answer this question is users must enter a username and password to access the application. And application manages its own credential store. So for that very reason, you will need to use password-based SSO in this case. Let's head to Microsoft documentation to understand this in more detail. So friends, there are several ways you can configure an application for SSO. Now, choosing an SSO method depends on how the application is configured for authentication. Let's go through this flowchart to understand how and what parameters you need to take into consideration when you are deciding the SSO method for your application. So folks, if you are developing a new application, yes, you should start looking at OpenID Connect and OAuth. But if you are not developing a new application, then comes, are you ready to configure single sign-on for an existing app? If you are, then yes. Is your app in the cloud or on-premise? If it is in the cloud, then you need to think about whether my application supports a SAML-based protocol or not. If it supports, then you will choose SAML-based authentication. If it does not support, then you will see whether your app authenticates with username or password. If it supports, then you can see you will choose password-based authentication. If it doesn't support, you will disable it. Before looking at other parts of this flowchart, let's look at what you will do if your existing application is an on-premise based application. Now, if your application is an on-premise based application, again, you will see whether it supports SAML-based protocol. If it supports, then you will choose SAML-based authentication. And if it does not support SAML-based authentication, then you will choose, or basically you will see whether your app can authenticate with IWA. If it supports IWA, then you will choose IWA. And if it does not support IWA, then you will check whether your app supports authentication with HTTP headers. If it supports HTTP headers, then you will choose header based. And if it does not support, then the last option is you will need to see whether your app can authenticate with username and password. If it supports, you will choose password based. If it does not, then basically your authentication will be disabled. So folks, this is a very clear flowchart telling you what are the parameters you need to take into consideration when deciding which of the authentication method you need to configure for SSO of your application. Now, the key thing that you can get from this configuration flowchart is if you are developing a new application, then the recommendation is OpenID Correct and OAuth. But if your application is like already existing, so there are different parameters that you need to take into consideration. If it is a cloud-based application, then the first choice is SAML authentication, which you would have seen at many places in your organization. But if the application doesn't support SAML-based authentication, then the next option is to choose password-based authentication. Now, if the application is on-premise, then basically, again, the first preference is SAML-based authentication, or the second preference is any of your identity provider. Basically, you integrate it with your identity provider. And then the next one is header-based. And finally, I would say the password-based authentication is the last option that you should look for, because even though you will configure it as an SSO, but it won't be a true SSO because you will have to input your username and password every time. However, the key requirement in this question was that the application does not support identity providers. So IWA was out of picture. And then the application had its own credential store. And one of the requirement was users must enter a username and password to access the application. That is the reason we have chosen password-based authentication. So friends, I hope you now understand why option D, password based, is the correct answer here. Question number 5. You are developing an app that will read activity logs for an Azure subscription by using Azure functions. You need to recommend an authentication solution for Azure functions. The solution must minimize administrative effort. What should you include in the recommendation? And your options are an enterprise application in Entra ID, application registration in Entra ID, system assigned managed identities, shared access signatures, or SaaS. System assigned managed identities are correct answer here because they provide a secure, automatically managed identity for Azure functions, eliminating the need for manual credential management and reducing administrative effort. They integrate seamlessly with Azure services, ensuring secure access to resources like activity log without the need for additional configuration or secret handling. Now, folks, again, let's head to Microsoft documentation to understand the different types of managed identities. So, folks, there are basically two types of managed identities. One is the system assigned and the other one is user assigned. Now, some Azure resources such as virtual machine allow you to enable a managed identity directly on the resource, which is what is system assigned. When you enable a system assigned managed identity, a service principal of a special type is created in Microsoft Entra ID for the identity. The service principal is tied to the lifecycle of that Azure resource. When the Azure resource is deleted, Azure automatically deletes the service principal for you. By design, only that Azure resource can use this identity to request tokens from Microsoft Entra ID. You authorize the managed identity to have access to one or more services. The name of the system assigned service principal is always same as the name of the Azure resources it is created for. For a deployment slot, the name of its system managed identity is app name /slot/slot name. So folks, I hope you now understand what is system assigned managed identity. Let's now look at user assigned managed identity. You may also create a managed identity as a standalone Azure resource. You can create a user assigned managed identity and assign it to one or more Azure resources. When you enable a user-assigned identity, a service principal of a special type is created in Microsoft Entra ID for the identity. The service principal is managed separately from the resource that uses it. This is the key difference between the system assigned and the user assigned. System assigned is assigned to that particular resource and gets deleted when that resource is deleted. But the user assigned is managed separately and it doesn't get deleted when the resource get deleted. Basically, user managed identity can be used by multiple resources. You authorize the managed identity to have access to one or more services. So folks, you can go through this documentation whose link was already on your screen if you want to understand more about system assigned managed identity and user assigned managed identity. I would highly recommend you to understand these topics in more detail, as there can be a lot of variation of just the example questions that I am bringing in front of you. Sixth question of the series. You have an Azure subscription that contains 1,000 resources. You need to generate compliance reports for the subscription. The solution must ensure that the resources can be grouped by department. What should you use to organize the resources? Your options are Azure policy and tags, application groups and quotas, resource groups and role assignments, administrative units, and Azure Lighthouse. Friends, this is one of the easiest questions that you will get in Azure Solution Architect's expert exam. To generate compliance report and ensure resources can be grouped by department, you should use Azure policy and tags. Friends, I think this question is more applicable to AZ-900 exam. It is so simple. It is just the basic concept that everyone who is working with Azure should know. Now, using Azure policy and tags, you can apply tags to resources to group them by department, and you create policies to enforce tagging rules, ensuring all resources have the necessary tags for proper categorization and compliance reporting. Next question. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure blob storage account named Store1. You have an on-premise file server named Server1 that runs Windows Server 2022. Server1 stores 500 GB of company files. You need to store a copy of the company files from Server1 in Store1. Which two possible Azure services achieve this goal? And your options are an Azure Logic Apps integration account, an Azure import export job, an Azure Analysis Services on-premise data gateway, an Azure batch account, Azure Data Factory. Folks, the two services that you can use to achieve the goal of copying the files from an on-premise server to Azure storage account are import export job and Azure Data Factory. Now, Azure import export job allows you to transfer large amounts of data to Azure blob storage by shipping hard drives to an Azure data center. This method is efficient for transferring large data sets like the 500 GB of company files. And Azure Data Factory is a data integration service that enables you to create, schedule, and orchestrate data workflows. You can use Azure Data Factory to create a pipeline that copies files from your on-premise server to the Azure blob storage account. You have an Azure subscription. The subscription has a blob container that contains multiple blobs. Multiple users in the finance department of your company plan to access the blobs during the month of April. You need to recommend a solution to enable access to the blobs during the month of April only. Which security solution should you include in the recommendation? And your options are conditional access policies, certificates, shared access signatures, access keys. You should include shared access signature in your recommendation. Shared access signatures, also called as SAS, allow you to grant limited access to Azure storage resources, such as blobs, for a specified period. In this case, you can create a SAS token that provides access to the blobs in the container for the month of April. The SAS token can be configured to expire at the end of April, ensuring that access is automatically revoked after the specified period. This approach is secure and ensures that access is time-bound, meeting the requirement of enabling access only during April. Folks, let's head to Azure portal to understand how you can create a shared access signature token and how you can configure these time-based settings. And there are more settings that you can control. So friends, there are two ways to generate a SaaS token. Either you can generate a token which gives them access at storage account level, or you can even go a further level down and you can create a SaaS token which gives them access at container level. So let's first try to create a SaaS token at account level and see what all properties are available. So to create a SaaS token at storage account level, in the left blade, if you scroll down, you will see an option shared access signatures. Now, once you are into that menu, then you get a bunch of options. Basically, you can see you can choose which all services are allowed, and the options available are blob, file, queue, or table. So what it tells you is you can limit access to a particular type of service using the shared access signature. For example, you want to give your consumers or customers just access to manage blob storage or queue storage or table storage. So you can do that level of segregation with SaaS token. So for this instance, let's just choose blob. Now, allowed service type, you can choose whether you want to give them at an access at service level, or you need to give them access at container level, or you need to give them access at blob level. For this use case, let's select service. Now then comes the next part, which is the allowed permission. Say shared access signature, does it just give them read-only permission, or it gives them write, delete, list, immutable storage, update, permanent delete? These are different type of permissions that are available in the storage account. So you should always follow the principle of least privileged access. So if you are creating a SaaS token for a customer who just needs to read blobs, so the allowed permission should just be read. Or maybe you could give them access to upload, which is like write access, and not give them delete. So based on your requirements, you have to choose the properties here. Now, the next part is blob versioning permissions, enable deletion of versions, then allow blob index permission. So there are certain permissions that you can choose based on your requirement. Then comes the part which was being talked about in our question, start and expiry date. So you can set a certain period during which this SaaS token will work. So, for example, you want this token to get active after 10 days. So maybe you could choose that particular date. Obviously, I'm getting a warning because my start date is before the end date. So if I change my end date also, the warning goes away. Now you can choose a particular time as well on when this SaaS token becomes active and on when this SaaS token gets deactivated. So the question was talking about granting access just throughout the month of April. So that's how you can limit it to a particular duration, and you just don't need to wait for April to start and then generate the token. And then you can choose the time zone as well. Now, the next part is allowed IP addresses. So, for example, you want to restrict access to just a subset of users, maybe within your organization. So you can have your IP range of your internal virtual networks here specified so that the token just works from inside the organization. For example, if the token gets leaked and someone tries to access your blobs over the internet, but if you have the IP address restriction already specified, their requests will be denied even though the blob had read or write access. Now, then you have the option to specify the allowed protocols. The recommendation is just to use HTTPS, but you have option to choose HTTPS and HTTP as well. Preferred routing tier is more around like if you are using the Microsoft backbone and those sort of things. So you can change these tiers, and then you need to choose the signing key. Basically, there are two signing keys that get created by default. You can go ahead and create others as well, the custom keys. But for now, I'll just keep signing key 1 and then generate SaaS and connection string. Here, the connection string has got generated, the SaaS token has got generated, and the blob service SaaS URL has also got generated. So you could probably share this URL with your customers or consumers, and they should be able to access the storage account using this URL. Basically, the blob SaaS URL is just a combination of SaaS token and connection string, so you do not really need to share them separately if you are just sharing the SaaS URL. Now, this is how you generate a SaaS token which gives them access at the storage account level. Here you do have option if you want to limit it to containers, you can select container as well. But if you just want to limit it to, let's say you have 10 containers in a storage account and you want to limit it to just one of them. So the way you do it is you need to go into your containers, and then, for example, I just have a logs container at the moment. I need to grant this logs container access to customer. So you need to click on the three dots on the right hand side of the container and select generate SaaS. Now you can see the difference here. The options are a bit less because now the SaaS token that you are creating is pretty much restricted to this particular container only. Signing method, again, you can either use the account key, which we briefly discussed when we were creating the SaaS token at container level, or you do have option to create user delegation keys as well. I don't have access to my account at this point. Let's switch to account key. Then again, you can see both the keys. Then you do have option to use stored access policies as well. I have not created any stored access policy, but if you want, you can create. Now the next part is again the pretty standard options that you could see, the permissions that your SaaS token needs to have. All the options are standard here. Just the difference is that earlier you were creating a SaaS token which was giving access at the account level. Now you are creating a SaaS token which is giving them access at the container level. So folks, I hope you now understand how we create SaaS token, and you have more context around how you need to approach whenever you have such questions in the exam. So multiple questions can be formed which would be revolving around SaaS token. In this question, we were talking about a particular time frame. Then we could also say that the requirement could be that the access needs to be granted from a subset of IPs. You know, we can do that as well here by using the allowed IPs. Maybe the question could be that the allowed protocol is just HTTPS and not HTTP. So again, you have the option to implement that limitation as well here. Let's head back to our questions now. Question number 9. You have several Azure App Service web apps that use Azure Key Vault to store data encryption keys. Several departments have the following requests to support the web app. Which service should you recommend for each department's request? Now, the first department is Quality Assurance Department, and the requirement is require temporary administrator access to create and configure additional web apps in the test environment. And your options are Entra ID Privileged Identity Management, Azure Managed Identity, Entra ID Connect, Entra ID Identity Protection. And folks, the correct answer here would be option A, Entra ID Privileged Identity Management. Also called as Entra PIM, allows you to manage, control, and monitor access within Entra ID, including providing just-in-time privileged access to Azure resources with temporary elevation for specific roles like administrator. This fits the requirement for temporary access. Now let's look at the requirement of next department, which is development department. And the requirement from development department is enable the applications to access Key Vault and retrieve keys for use in code. And again, you have the same 4 options. Now, to satisfy this requirement, you should use Azure Managed Identity. Azure Managed Identity is specifically designed to provide Azure services like app service, virtual machines with an automatically managed identity in Entra ID, allowing them to authenticate against Azure services like Key Vault without the need to manage credentials in your code. Now let's look at the requirement from a third department, which is security department. Review the membership of administrative roles and require users to provide a justification for continued membership. Get alerts about changes in administrator assignments. See a history of administrator activation. Again, you have all those 4 options. And folks, you should recommend Entra ID PIM in this case as well. Now, Entra ID PIM is designed for managing, controlling, and monitoring privileged access to Azure AD roles, and it allows you to review and manage the membership of administrative roles, require justification for continued role membership, receive alerts on changes in administrator assignments, and view a history of role activation and changes. And this is the reason why Entra ID PIM is perfect to satisfy the requirement of security department. Let's look at next question. You plan to deploy an app that will use an Azure storage account. You need to deploy the storage account. The storage account must meet the following requirements. Store the data for multiple users. Encrypt each user's data by using a separate key. Encrypt all the data in the storage account by using customer managed keys. What 2 options can you deploy? And your options are blobs in a general purpose V2 storage account, files in a premium file share storage account, blobs in an Azure Data Lake Storage Zen 2 account, files in a general purpose V2 storage account. Folks, 2 most suited options for the given requirement would be option A and option C. General purpose V2 storage accounts can store data for multiple users effectively, handling large scale applications. It allows for encryption at the blob level, which means you can encrypt individual blobs with different keys managed via Azure Key Vault, and it supports encryption with customer managed keys from Azure Key Vault, giving you control over encryption. Now, Azure Data Lake Storage Zen 2 is specifically designed for big data analytics workloads with a hierarchical namespace, which might be advantageous if you need fine-grained control over data organization and access, particularly in analytics scenarios. It supports a hierarchical namespace, enabling more efficient data management, especially in scenarios involving complex data structure. So friends, if your focus is purely on blob storage with no specific need for hierarchical namespace or big data analytics, blobs in a general purpose V2 storage account is indeed a very suitable and flexible choice. If your workload involves complex data structure or big data analytics, then Azure Data Lake Storage Zen 2 could provide more benefits. So if there is any more requirement added to the 3 requirements which are already mentioned, then you might have to drill down to just one option. But in our case, the requirement is a bit generic. So option A and option C both satisfy the requirement. Next question. You are designing an Azure governance solution. All Azure resources must be easily identifiable based on the following operational information, which is environment, owner, department, and cost center. You need to ensure that you can use the operational information when you generate reports for the Azure resources. What should you include in the solution? Your options are an Azure data catalog that uses the Azure REST API as a data source, Microsoft Entra ID administrative units, an Azure management group that uses parent group to create a hierarchy, an Azure policy that enforces tagging rules. Friends, this is again one of the simplest questions that you can get in AZ-305 exam. And to ensure that all resources are easily identifiable based on operational information like environment, owner, department, and cost center, and to use this information for generating reports, you should apply Azure policy that enforces tagging values and rules. This is similar to a question we covered in last part of the series as well. So if you still have any doubts, then please post in the comment section and I'll try to address them as soon as possible. You have an Entra ID tenant named contoso.com that has a security group named Group 1. Group 1 is configured for assigned membership. Group 1 has 50 members, including 20 guest users. You need to recommend a solution for evaluating the membership of Group 1. The solution must meet the following requirements. Now, your requirements are: the evaluation must be repeated automatically every 3 months. Every member must be able to report whether they need to be in Group 1. Users who report that they do not need to be in Group 1 must be removed from Group 1 automatically. Users who do not report whether they need to be in Group 1 must be removed from Group 1 automatically. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are: change the membership type of Group 1 to dynamic user, implement Entra ID identity protection, implement Entra ID privileged identity management, create an access review. And friends, you should create an access review to meet the specified requirements. Let's understand how each of these requirements is satisfied by using access reviews. Now, access reviews in Entra ID can be configured to repeat automatically, such as every 3 months, which satisfies the automatic reevaluation requirement. Users can be prompted during the review to indicate if they need to remain in the group. This allows every member to report their need to stay in group, which is also called as self-reporting. Now, users who either do not respond to the review or indicate they do not need to be in the group can be removed automatically based on the review result, which satisfies the last 2 requirements of automatic removal. Next question, friends. You have an Azure subscription. You plan to deploy a monitoring solution that will include the following: Azure Monitor Network Insights, Application Insights, Microsoft Sentinel, VM Insights. The monitoring solution will be managed by a single team. What is the minimum number of Azure Monitor Log Analytics workspaces required? Your options are 1, 2, 3, and 4. Folks, the minimum number of log analytics workspace required in this case would be 1. Reason being, all the services mentioned here, which is Azure Monitor, Network Insights, Application Insight, Microsoft Sentinel, and VM Insights, can send their log and metrics to a single log analytics workspace. Next question, folks. You have an Azure subscription. You need to deploy a relational database. The solution must meet the following requirements: support multiple read-only replicas, automatically load balance read-only requests across all the read-only replicas, minimize administrative effort. What should you use? Now, the first part of the question is you need to tell which of the following service you need to choose: a single Azure SQL database, an Azure SQL database elastic pool, Azure SQL managed instances. Now, correct option here is option A, Azure SQL database, as it supports active geo-replication and auto failover groups, which allow for up to 4 read-only replicas, and these read-only replicas can automatically handle and balance read-only workloads. The service is fully managed, requiring minimal manual intervention. Let's now look at next part of this question: service tier. Your options are business critical, hyperscale, or premium. Now, friends, in premium and business critical service tiers, only one of the read-only replica is accessible at any given time. Hyperscale supports multiple read-only replicas, which is one of the requirements. So option B is the correct choice in this case. There is a link on your screen at the moment. If you want to read more about these scaling out things in Azure SQL, then go through the link. Your company has the divisions shown in the following table. You basically have two divisions named East and West. East is hosted in sub 1 subscription and West is hosted in sub 2 subscription. Now, East division uses a intra ID tenant named DevOpsHub.com and West division uses a intra ID tenant named techwithjaspal.com. Sub 1 contains an Azure App Service web app named App1. App1 uses intra ID for single tenant user authentication. Users from DevOpsHub.com can authenticate to App1. You need to recommend a solution to enable users in the techwithjaspal.com domain to authenticate to App1. What should you recommend? Your options are configure the intra ID provisioning service, configure intra ID join, configure supported account types in the application registration and update the sign-in endpoint, enable intra ID pass-through authentication and update the sign-in endpoint. Friends, to achieve this, first you will have to configure supported account types in the application registration and then update the sign-in endpoint, which is option C. Next question. You are designing an app that will be hosted on Azure virtual machines that run Ubuntu. The app will use a third-party email service to send email messages to the users. The third-party email service requires that the app authenticate by using an API key. You need to recommend an Azure Key Vault solution for storing and accessing the API key. The solution must minimize administrative effort. What should you recommend using to store and access the key? Now for storage, you have three options, basically certificate, key, and secret. Folks, API keys are typically stored as secrets in Azure Key Vault. The Azure Key Vault can store and manage secrets like API keys, passwords, or database connection strings. Now the next part of the question is access. Whether it needs to be an API token, a managed identity, or a service principal. And folks, you should use managed identity for the virtual machines. Managed identities allow your app running on the virtual machine to securely access Azure Key Vault without needing to manage credentials manually. Question number 17. You have an Azure subscription that contains 10 web apps. The apps are integrated with Entra ID and are accessed by users on different project teams. The users frequently move between projects. You need to recommend an access management solution for the web apps. The solution must meet the following requirements. Now your requirements are the users must only access to the app of the project to which they are assigned currently. Project managers must verify which users have access to their project's app and remove users that are no longer assigned to their project. Once every 30 days, the project managers must be prompted automatically to verify which users are assigned to their projects. What should you include in the recommendation? And your options are Entra ID Identity Protection, Microsoft Defender for Identity, Microsoft Entra Permissions Management, Entra ID Identity Governance. The best recommendation for this scenario is Entra ID Identity Governance. Now, Entra ID Identity Governance includes features like access reviews, which allow project managers to verify user access to apps regularly. This meets the requirement of prompting project managers every 30 days to review and manage user access. Now, role assignment in Entra ID helps ensure that users only have access to the resources they currently need based on their role or project assignment. This aligns with the requirement for users to access only the app of the project they are currently assigned to. And utilizing automated processes in Enter ID can automate the process of reviewing and updating access permissions, making it easier for project managers to maintain proper access controls without manual intervention. Let's look at next question, folks. You have an Azure subscription that contains 50 Azure SQL databases. You create an Azure Resource Manager template named template1 that enables transparent data encryption, which is TDE. You need to create an Azure policy definition named policy1 that will use template1 to enable TDE for any non-compliant Azure SQL databases. How should you configure policy1? Now, there are different parts of this question. The first one is set available effects to. Your options are deploy if not exists, enforce, regio policy, modify. Folks, you will need to set available effects to deploy if not exists. A deploy if not exists policy definition executes a template deployment when the condition is met. Now, the next part of the question is include in the definition. Your options are the identity required to perform the remediation task, the scope of the policy assignment, the role-based access control RBAC roles required to perform the remediation task. Friends, you will need to include the identity required to perform the remediation task in the policy definition. Managed identity is necessary for the policy to execute the ARM template and apply the remediation. Now, the other two options, which is the scope of the policy assignment and the role-based access control roles required to perform the remediation task, are typically specified when assigning the policy, not within the policy definition itself. So you need to understand what is included in the policy definition and what is used when you are assigning the policy. You need all the three options, but the difference is option A is required in the policy definition and option B and option C are required when you are assigning the policy. Now, the scenario that is being talked about in this question is clearly documented on the Microsoft website as well. There is the link on your screen at the moment. Go through this link to understand how you can implement this scenario in real world. Next question. You need to design a storage solution for an app that will store large amounts of frequently used data. The solution must meet the following requirements. Your requirements are maximize data throughput, prevent the modification of data for 1 year, minimize latency for read and write operations. Which Azure storage account type and storage service should you recommend? Now, the first part of the question is talking about storage account type, and your options are blob storage, blob storage, file storage, storage version 2 with premium performance, storage version 2 with standard performance. And folks, the storage account that you should recommend in this case is blob storage. Blob storage is designed for workloads that require low latency and high throughput, making it ideal for scenarios where performance is critical. Now, the next part of the question was storage service, and your options are blob, file, table. And folks, you should recommend blob service in this case. Blob storage is optimized for storing massive amounts of unstructured data, and it can handle frequently accessed data easily. Azure Blob Storage supports object-level immutability policies, which can prevent the modification of data for a certain period, satisfying the requirement to prevent data modification for 1 year. So folks, I hope you now understand why those two options were chosen as the correct choice. But if you still have any doubts, please post them in the comment section. Question number 20. You are planning an Azure IoT Hub solution that will include 50,000 IoT devices. Each device will stream data, including temperature, device ID, and time data. Approximately 50,000 records will be written every second. The data will be visualized in a near real time. You need to recommend a service to store and query the data. Which two services can you recommend? Your options are Azure Table Storage, Azure Event Grid, Azure Cosmos DB SQL API, Azure Time Series Insights. And folks, the two services that you should recommend in this case are option C and option D, which is Azure Cosmos DB SQL API and Azure Time Series Insights. Now, Azure Cosmos DB is a highly scalable, globally distributed database that can handle large volumes of data with low latency. The SQL API allows for querying the data efficiently, making it suitable for real-time data ingestion and querying. Now, Cosmos DB also supports high throughput scenarios, making it a good fit for handling 50,000 records per second. The next service, Azure Time Series Insights, is specifically designed for storing, querying, and visualizing time series data from IoT devices. It provides real-time insights into the data, which is perfect for scenarios where you need to visualize data in near real time. It can handle high ingestion rates and provide powerful tools for analyzing time-stamped data. Now let's look at why other options are incorrect, folks. Azure Table Storage, while scalable, it's not designed for real-time querying and visualizing of large volumes of IoT data. It is more suitable for simple, low-cost storage of structured data. Then the last option, which is Azure Event Grid, it is used for event-driven architectures and routing events, not for storing and querying large data sets. So folks, if you are liking the content, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe the channel. You have an app named EP1 that uses two on-premise Microsoft SQL Server databases named DB1 and DB2. You plan to migrate DB1 and DB2 to Azure. You need to recommend an Azure solution to host DB1 and DB2. The solution must meet the following requirements, and the two requirements that are given are support server-side transactions across DB1 and DB2, minimize administrative effort to update the solution. What should you recommend? Your options are two databases on the same SQL Server instance on an Azure virtual machine, two Azure SQL databases in an elastic pool, two Azure SQL databases on different Azure SQL database servers, two databases on the same Azure SQL managed instance. Friends, first key to rule out an option is minimize administrative effort, which means we are looking for a managed service. So we can rule out option A, as SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine will introduce administrative effort. Now, second key to rule out option is support for server-side transactions. And for that very reason, we will have to go with option D, two databases on same Azure SQL managed instance. Now, a server-side distributed transactions using Transact SQL are available only for Azure SQL managed instance. If the question was talking about client-side transactions, then Azure SQL database was also the right choice. So that is why I stressed upon that server-side distributed transaction is something which is helping us eliminate some incorrect choices. Now, the distributed transactions can be executed only between instances that belong to the same server trust group. In this scenario, managed instances need to use linked server to reference each other. Now, folks, before we proceed forward, I wanted to let you know about my presence on TopMate. Whether you are preparing for certifications, shifting into DevOps or cloud roles, looking for hands-on guidance with tools like Jenkins, GitHub Actions, Ansible, Terraform, and so on, or seeking help with your resume, job search, or mock interviews, I offer tailored one-to-one mentoring sessions to give you a clear, confident path forward. Feel free to use this link to book a session with me, and I'll be more than happy to guide you through the journey. Link to my TopMate profile will be available in the description section of this video. And if you have any queries, you can always reach out to me at devopshub2023@gmail.com before making the booking, and I'll be happy to sort those out for you. This is question number 22 of the series. You have an on-premise database that you plan to migrate to Azure. You need to design the database architecture to meet the following requirements. And your requirements are: the architecture should support scaling up and down. It should support geo-redundant backups. It should support a database of up to 75 terabyte. And it should be optimized for online transaction processing (OLTP). What should you include in the recommendation? Now, the first part of the question is around the service that you should include. And your options are Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance, Azure Synapse Analytics, SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. Folks, the suitable service for the given requirement will be Azure SQL Database. Now, Azure SQL Database is a fully managed database service with built-in capabilities for scalability, geo-redundancy, and backup. And it is designed for OLTP workloads. Let's now understand why other options are incorrect here. Now, option B, Azure SQL Managed Instance, does not support over 8 terabyte database sizes. Option C, Azure Synapse Analytics is best suited for data warehousing and analytics, which is OLAP. And the last option, SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine, is not ideal as it's not a managed service. Now, the next part of the question is talking about which service tier should you use for the service that you chose in the previous part of the question. Your options are basic, business critical, general purpose, hyperscale, premium, and standard. And folks, you will need to choose hyperscale service tier because it supports up to 100 terabyte data size, and our requirement is to have a support of 75 terabyte, which is not supported by any other service tiers. Let's look at next question. You have an Azure subscription that contains a storage account. An application sometimes writes duplicate files to the storage account. You have a PowerShell script that identifies and deletes duplicate files in the storage account. Currently, the script is run manually after approval from the operations manager. You need to recommend a serverless solution that performs the following actions: runs the script once an hour to identify whether duplicate files exist, sends an email notification to the operations manager requesting approval to delete the duplicate files, process an email response from the operations manager specifying whether the deletion was approved, runs the script if the deletion was approved. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are combination of different services. And the first one is Azure Logic Apps and Azure Event Grid, Azure Pipelines and Azure Service Fabric, Azure Logic Apps and Azure Functions, Azure Functions and Azure Batch. Folks, you can use a combination of Azure Logic Apps and Functions to achieve the given requirement. Now, you use Azure Logic Apps to create a workflow that runs the PowerShell script once an hour using a time-based trigger, sends an email notification to the operations manager for approval, and processes the email response. Now, you use Azure Functions to host the PowerShell script, which can be triggered by the Logic app when the operations manager approves the deletion as well. Combining Azure Logic Apps and Azure Functions will provide the necessary components to meet the requirement of this scenario. Question number 24. You are designing an application that will aggregate content for users. You need to recommend a database solution for the application. The solution must meet the following requirements. It should support SQL commands. It should support multi-master writes and guarantee low latency read operations. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Azure SQL Database that uses active geo-replication, Azure SQL Database Hyperscale, Azure Database for PostgreSQL, Azure Cosmos DB SQL API. For an application that requires SQL support, multi-master writes, and low latency read operations, the best recommendation is Azure Cosmos DB with the SQL API. Cosmos DB provides a SQL API allowing you to query the data using SQL-like commands and supports multi-master configurations, allowing write operations in multiple regions. This ensures high availability and enables low latency writes from any region. Now, Cosmos DB also offers automatic distribution of data across multiple regions with configurable read replicas that provide low latency reads globally. So folks, if you still have any doubts in why I have chosen Azure Cosmos DB SQL API, then please post your doubts in the comment section and I'll try to address them as soon as possible. You have an on-premise network and an Azure subscription. The on-premise network has several branch offices. A branch office in Toronto contains a virtual machine named VM1 that is configured as a file server. Users access the shared files on VM1 from all the offices. You need to recommend a solution to ensure that the users can access the shared files as quickly as possible if Toronto branch office is inaccessible. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are a recovery services vault and Windows Server backup, Azure blob container and Azure file sync, a recovery services vault and Azure backup, an Azure file share and Azure file sync. And folks, the correct answer here is option D, an Azure file share and Azure file sync. Azure File Share provides a cloud-based SMB file share that can be mounted to any office, ensuring fast access to files, even if the original on-prem VM is unavailable. And Azure File Sync allows you to centralize your file share in Azure and sync files from your on-premise VM to an Azure file share. In case the Toronto branch office is inaccessible, users can access the files directly from the Azure file share without interruption. By caching frequently accessed files in Azure, Azure File Sync ensures that users can still access important files quickly. Folks, let's look at question number 26. You have an Azure subscription. The subscription contains 100 virtual machines that run Windows Server 2022 and have the Azure Monitor agent installed. You need to recommend a solution that meets the following requirements: forwards JSON formatted logs from the virtual machine to a log analytics workspace, transforms the logs and stores the data in a table in the log analytics workspace. What should you include in the recommendation? And the first part of the question is to forward the logs, what should you include? And your options are a linked storage account for the log analytics workspace, an Azure Monitor data collection endpoint, a service endpoint. Folks, for forwarding the logs, you should use Azure Monitor data collection endpoint. Azure Monitor Data Collection Endpoint, also called as DCE, is designed to forward logs from various sources, including virtual machines, to a log analytics workspace. It allows you to collect custom log data in JSON format and forward it for analysis. DCE, in combination with DCR, which is data collection rules, allows you to transform log data before it is ingested into log analytics, and after transformation, the logs are stored in a custom or predefined table in the log analytics workspace. Now, folks, the next part of this question is, what should you include in the recommendation to transform the logs and store the data? Your options are a KQL query, a WQL query, an XPath query. To transform the logs and store the data in Azure Log Analytics, you should use KQL queries. KQL query language is used by Azure Log Analytics to query and transform data in the workspace. KQL allows you to parse, filter, and manipulate the data being stored in the log analytics tables. It is specifically designed for log queries and data manipulation in the Azure environment. Now, friends, let's understand why other options are incorrect. WQL, which is WMI query language, is used to query information from Windows Management Instrumentation, which is WMI, typically for performance or configuration data on Windows system, but it is not used for transforming and querying logs in Azure Log Analytics. Now, XPath is a query language used for selecting nodes from XML documents, not for querying or transforming log data in Log Analytics. Folks, if you are liking the content, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe the channel. Question number 27. You have a multi-tier app named App1 and an Azure SQL database named SQL1. The backend service of App1 writes data to SQL1. Users use the App1 client to read the data from SQL1. During periods of high utilization, the users experience delays retrieving the data. You need to minimize how long it takes for data requests. What should you include in the solution? Your options are Azure Cache for Redis, Azure Content Delivery Network, Azure Data Factory, Azure Synapse Analytics. Friends, to minimize delays in retrieving data during periods of high utilization in the app, the best solution would be Azure Cache for Redis. Because it stores frequently accessed data in memory, allowing for faster data retrieval compared to querying the database every time. It is ideal for improving application performance by reducing latency and offloading the backend database during high utilization periods. Now let's understand why other options are incorrect. Azure Content Delivery Network is used for delivering static content, which is images or videos from globally distributed servers. It is not designed for improving performance of database-driven applications. Azure Data Factory is a data integration service that automates data movement and transformation between sources. It's not relevant for caching or minimizing database query response times. And Azure Synapse Analytics is designed for large-scale data analysis and business intelligence, which is OLAP, which is not suited for low latency, high-speed transactional data access, which is OLTP as required in this case. Question number 28 of the series. You are designing an app that will include two components. The components will communicate by sending messages via a queue. You need to recommend a solution to process the messages by using a first in, first out pattern, which is FIFO pattern. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are storage queues with a custom metadata setting, Azure Service Bus queues with partitioning enabled, Azure Service Bus queues with sessions enabled, storage queues with a stored access policy. Folks, you should use Azure Service Bus queues with session enabled in this case. This ensures FIFO messaging because session enabled queues allow the messages that share the same session ID to be processed in the order they were sent. Now let's understand why other options are incorrect. Storage queues with custom metadata setting. Folks, storage queues do not natively support FIFO. Then the next option, Azure Service Bus queues with partitioning enabled. Partitioning does not guarantee FIFO as it distributes message across multiple partitions. And the next option was storage queues with a stored access policy. This is for controlling access, not for message ordering. You have an Azure subscription that contains the resources shown in the following table. You have 3 resources which are virtual machine type, and then you have 3 resources which are virtual network type. Now VM1 is a front-end component in the central US Azure region. VM2 is a backend component in the East US Azure region, and VM3 is a backend component in the East US 2 Azure region. VNet1 hosts VM1, VNet2 hosts VM2, and VNet3 hosts VM3. You create peering between VNet1 and VNet2, and between VNet1 and VNet3. The virtual machines hosts an HTTPS-based client-server application and are accessible only via the private IP address of each virtual machine. You need to implement a load balancing solution for VM2 and VM3. The solution must ensure that if VM2 fails, requests will be routed automatically to VM3, and if VM3 fails, requests will be routed automatically to VM2. What should you include in the solution? And folks, your options are Azure Firewall Premium, Azure Application Gateway version 2, a cross-region load balancer, Azure Front Door Premium. Friends, there are several factors that you need to take into consideration while answering this question. First one being requirement is to set up load balancing, so you can automatically rule out option A, Azure Firewall Premium, as it is for managing and filtering network traffic, not load balancing. Now, the second factor you need to take into consideration is that VMs are located in different Azure regions, which is Central US, East US, and East US 2. Based on this, you can rule out option B. Azure Application Gateway is region specific and is designed to handle traffic within a single region. Now, third and final requirement is to make use of private IPs, and for that very reason, you will rule out the use of cross-region load balancer. While both Azure Front Door Premium and cross-region load balancer support load balancing across regions, the cross-region load balancer does not support the use of private IPs. You can refer to the link on your screen to understand all the limitations of cross-region load balancers. Next question. You have an Azure subscription that contains the SQL servers on Azure shown in the following table. Now you have two SQL servers with the name of SQL SVR1 and SQL SVR2. SQL SVR1 is in resource group RG1 and is hosted in East US location, whereas SQL Server 2 is in RG2 and is hosted in West US location. The subscription contains the storage accounts shown in the following table. You have two storage accounts with the name of Storage 1 and Storage 2. Storage 1 is in RG1 resource group and is hosted in East US location and is of storage version 2, which is general purpose V2 storage kind. Storage 2 is hosted in RG2 and is located in Central US region and is of kind blob storage. You create the Azure SQL databases shown in the following table. You basically create three SQL databases with the name of SQL DB1, DB2, and DB3. SQL DB1 and DB2 are in SQL Server 1, whereas SQL DB3 is in SQL Server 2. Now, the pricing tier for SQL DB1 and SQL DB2 is standard, whereas SQL DB3 is premium. Now, for each of the following, select yes if the statement is true, otherwise select no. Your first statement is when you enable auditing for SQL DB1, you can store the audit information to Storage 1. This statement is correct, folks. You will be able to store audit information for SQL DB1 in Storage 1. We will shortly head to Azure portal to do a practical around this to understand the factors involved. But first, let's look at other statements of this question. Now, the next statement is when you enable auditing for SQL DB2, you can store the audit information to Storage 2. This is incorrect and not possible, folks. Let's look at third statement. When you enable auditing for SQL DB3, you can store the audit information to Storage 2. This is also an incorrect statement. You cannot store SQL DB3 audit information to Storage 2. Now, to understand the reason behind why a particular statement was chosen as right or wrong, I have created a Azure SQL server and then I have created multiple databases in it. And then I have created different storage accounts to replicate the kind of scenarios that we had in our question. I have tried to do a bit more than what is covered in the question so that you are prepared for certain variations of these type of questions as well. So what I have done is I have created a Azure SQL server, which is in West US region. Okay. And then I have created two databases in Azure SQL Server. Both of the databases are basically, one of the database is a standard pricing tier and the other one is using premium pricing tier, because that is what was done in our question. Now there was a talk about storage accounts. Let's go back to the storage accounts and have a look at them. Now the storage accounts that I have created are into different resource groups. I've created 3 storage accounts. 2 of them are in a different resource group than the one where the Azure SQL Server is hosted. And folks, the 2 of the storage accounts are in same location as the Azure SQL Server, whereas one storage account is in a different location. Now let's go back to our Azure SQL Server and explore the databases and try to configure the audit logging. So let's click on SQL databases. Let's first try to do something in standard pricing tier database. So how do you configure audit logging? Basically, you scroll down in the left-hand menu under security, you will see auditing. And now you have to just scroll down because the auditing is not enabled at the instance level. That is the reason why it says server level auditing is disabled. But we are going to enable it at database level. So what we'll do is enable Azure SQL auditing. If you enable it, you have option to choose the destination. Now there are 3 types of destinations that are supported. It is storage, log analytics, and event hub. To mimic the scenario in our question, we are going to choose storage. Now it is giving us to choose a subscription. I'll go ahead and choose my subscription. Now here you can see I have created 3 storage accounts, but only 2 storage accounts are showing up here because they are in the same region as our Azure SQL instance. Let's go back and confirm that. So how you will confirm, we'll go back to the overview section and you can see the location of the Azure SQL Server is West US. Now I'll go back to my storage accounts and you can see 2 storage accounts are in West US. What this tells us is no matter which resource group your storage accounts are created in, whether they are in the same resource group as your Azure SQL Server or they are in different resource group, doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters here is they need to be in the same region as the Azure SQL Server. That is the first part that you have to take into consideration while answering this question. Now the next data that was there in the question was focused on the pricing tier of the databases as well. So let's go ahead and see if pricing tier makes any difference. Again, we'll go to the databases and then we will we are already into the database. I have already opened the database. And what we'll try to do is, again, try to enable it. So here, what you will see is basically in first database, which is SQL DB 1407, both these storage accounts are showing up. And this storage, this database was, I guess, let's scroll back. This was using a standard pricing tier. So both the storage accounts are still showing up. Now let's go back to the other database, which was SQL DB 1989, which is a premium tier. Let's try to enable auditing for this and see how many storage accounts are showing up. So here you can see, I'll again go through the same options and I can see both the storage accounts are showing up here. What this tells us is pricing tier doesn't really matter in this case. Resource groups also don't really matter in this case, and even the account kind also doesn't matter in this case. What matters is the location of the SQL server and the location of the storage accounts. If they are in the same location, then you can go ahead and use them for your audit logging. If they are not in the same location, you can't use them. This is question number 31 of the series. You have SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine. Databases are written nightly as part of a batch process. You need to recommend a disaster recovery solution for the data. The solution must meet the following requirements: provide the ability to recover in the event of a regional outage, support a recovery time objective, which is RTO of 15 minutes, support a recovery point objective, which is RPO of 24 hours, support automated recovery, minimize costs. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Azure Virtual Machine Availability Sets, Azure Disk Backup, an always on availability group, Azure Site Recovery. Friends, the right Azure service for this use case would be option D, Azure Site Recovery. Whenever there are such questions which are very data driven and it's not possible to remember everything, then apply elimination approach. So the first option, availability sets only ensure that VMs within the same region are spread across different fault domains and update domains. They do not protect against regional outages, so it can be ruled out. Then the next option, disk backup, provides data protection but does not provide automated failover or protection in case of regional outages. So you can rule this one out as well. Now the third option, always on availability groups offer high availability and disaster recovery but require SQL Server Enterprise Edition, which is more expensive. So we can rule it out as we need to minimize costs as part of one of the requirements. So folks, I hope you now understand why Azure Site Recovery has been chosen as the correct answer in this case. Next question. You have a .NET web service named Service 1 that performs the following tasks: reads and writes temporary files to the local file system, writes to the application event log. You need to recommend a solution to host Service 1 in Azure. The solution must meet the following requirements: minimize maintenance overhead, minimize costs. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are an Azure App Service Web App, an Azure Virtual Machine Scale Set, an App Service Environment, which is ASE, an Azure Functions App. Folks, Azure App Service is the optimal choice as it provides a fully managed, scalable, and cost-effective platform for hosting a .NET web service with minimal maintenance overhead. While Azure Functions, Virtual Machine Scale Sets, and App Service Environments can also host web services, they will not provide the same balance of minimal maintenance overhead and cost effectiveness as Azure App Service web apps do in this scenario. Next question. Your company has 300 virtual machines hosted in a VMware environment. The virtual machines vary in size and have various utilization levels. You plan to move all the virtual machines to Azure. You need to recommend how many and what size Azure virtual machines will be required to move the current workloads to Azure. The solution must minimize administrative effort. What should you use to make the recommendation? Your options are Azure Pricing Calculator, Azure Advisor, Azure Migrate, and Azure Cost Management. Folks, Azure Migrate will be best suited for this use case. Let's head to MS documentation to understand this in more detail. So folks, let's go through discovery and assessment tool, which is part of Azure Migrate, as that will help us in answering why we have chosen Azure Migrate as the correct choice in this case. The Azure Migrate Discovery and Assessment tool discovers and assesses on-premise VMware VMs, Hyper-V VMs, and physical servers for migration to Azure. Here's what the tool does. Azure Readiness assesses whether on-premise servers, SQL Server, and web apps are ready for migration to Azure. This is one of the requirements of our question. Azure Sizing estimates the size of Azure VMs, Azure SQL configuration, number of Azure VMware solution nodes after migration. This is what the critical part is that has helped us in answering this question, because we are after how many VMs and what size Azure virtual machines will be required to move the current workloads to Azure. Azure cost estimation estimates costs for running on-premise servers in Azure. You get an idea around the costs as well. Then dependency analysis identifies cross-server dependencies and optimization strategies for moving interdependent servers to Azure. So folks, I hope you now understand why Azure Migrate has been chosen as the correct answer in this case. But if you still have any doubts, please post them in the comments section. Question number 34 of the series. You are deploying a sales application that will contain several Azure cloud services and handle different components of a transaction. Different cloud services will process customer orders, billing, payment, inventory, and shipping. You need to recommend a solution to enable the cloud services to asynchronously communicate transaction information by using XML messages. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Azure Service Fabric, Azure Data Lake, Azure Service Bus, and Azure Traffic Manager. Folks, the best recommendation for enabling asynchronous communication between the cloud services using XML messages is Azure Service Bus. Azure Service Bus is designed for asynchronous messaging between distributed applications. It allows cloud services to communicate reliably even if they are running at different times or speeds. It supports sending XML messages between services, enabling a message-based architecture where each cloud service can process different parts of a transaction and send messages to other services. Let's understand why their options are incorrect. Azure Service Fabric is a microservice orchestration platform, but it is primarily focused on hosting and managing microservices. Azure Data Lake is designed for big data storage and analytics, whereas Azure Traffic Manager is a DNS-based traffic routing service used to distribute incoming traffic across multiple endpoints. Let's look at next question. You have data files in Azure Blob Storage. You plan to transform the files and move them to Azure Data Lake Storage. You need to transform the data by using mapping data flow. Which service should you use? Your options are Azure Databricks, Azure Storage Sync, Azure Data Factory, Azure Databox Gateway. Folks, you should use Azure Data Factory in this case. Azure Data Factory is a cloud-based data integration service that allows you to create, schedule, and manage data pipelines that can move and transform data across different sources and destinations, including Azure Blob Storage and Azure Data Lake Storage. As always, let's understand the use case of other services. Azure Databricks is a cloud-based analytics platform that allows you to process large amounts of data using Apache Spark. It can also be used for data transformation and ETL, but it requires more technical expertise and development effort than using Azure Data Factory mapping data flows. Azure Storage Sync is a service that allows you to sync on-premise file servers with Azure file shares, but it does not support data transformation. And friends, Azure Databox Gateway is a hardware device that allows you to transfer large amounts of data to Azure, but it does not support data transformation using mapping data flow. Our company plans to implement an HTTP-based API to support a web app. The web app allows customers to check the status of their orders. The API must meet the following requirements: implement Azure functions, provide public read-only operations, prevent write operations. You need to recommend which HTTP methods and authorization level to configure. What should you recommend? Now, the first part of the question is talking about HTTP methods, and your options are API methods, get only, get and post only, get, post, and options only. Folks, you should use the get HTTP method in this case. as it is typically used for retrieving data without modifying it, and there is a requirement in the question to prevent write operations. Now, the next part of the question was focused around authorization level, and your options are function, anonymous, and admin. For the authorization, you can set it to anonymous. Since the API needs to be publicly accessible for read-only operations, this will enable any user to access the API without providing a key, allowing them to check the status of their orders as required. Both the other options require passing some sort of key, which is not ideal or a practical solution for this use case. Next question. Your on-premise network contains a file server named server 1 that stores 500 GB of data. You need to use Azure Data Factory to copy the data from server 1 to Azure storage. You add a new data factory. What should you do next? Now, in the questions, the first part is what should you do from server 1? Your options are install an Azure file sync agent, install a self-hosted integration runtime, install the file server resource manager role service. Folks, you will have to install self-hosted integration runtime. A self-hosted integration runtime can run copy activities between a cloud data store and a data store in a private network. It also can dispatch transform activities against compute resources in an on-premise network or an Azure virtual network. The installation of a self-hosted integration runtime needs an on-premise machine or a virtual machine inside a private network. That is the reason to choose self-hosted integration runtime installation. Now, the next part of the question is from the data factory. And your options are create a pipeline, create an Azure import export job, provision an Azure SQL Server Integration Services, which is SSIS integration runtime. And folks, you will need to create a pipeline. A pipeline is a logical grouping of activities that perform the task of copying the data from server 1 to Azure storage. Question number 38. You plan to deploy Azure Databricks to support a machine learning application. Data engineers will mount an Azure Data Lake storage account to the Databricks file system. Permissions to folders are granted directly to the data engineers. You need to recommend a design for the planned Databrick deployment. The solution must meet the following requirements. Ensure that the data engineers can only access folders to which they have permissions, minimize development effort, minimize costs. What should you include in the recommendation? And the first part of the question is talking about Databricks SKU. And you only have two options, which is premium or standard. And folks, you will have to choose premium SKU of the Databricks. Choosing premium SKU is driven by second part of this question. So let's first look at it to understand it in more detail. Cluster configuration. Your options are credential pass-through, managed identities, ML flow, a runtime that contains Photon, secret scope. And friends, you will have to use credential pass-through to meet the given requirements. Now, credential pass-through allows users to authenticate with Azure Data Lake storage using their own Entra ID credentials. This minimizes development effort and costs as it does not require additional Entra ID application registration and service principal management. And folks, premium Databricks SKU is required for credential pass-through, which is why we can't use a standard SKU in this case. Next question. You need to recommend a solution to generate a monthly report of all the new Azure Manager resource deployments in your Azure subscription. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Azure Activity Log, Azure Advisor, Azure Analysis Services, Azure Monitor Action Groups. Folks, Azure Activity Log tracks all management operations in an Azure subscription, including resource deployments. It provides detailed records of when resources were created, modified, or deleted. You can query the activity log for deployment events and filter by the resource type, time range, and specific actions like resource creation. The logs can be exported to log analytics, storage, or event hubs for further analysis or reporting, making it easier to generate a monthly report. Now, folks, let's understand why other options are incorrect. Azure Advisor provides recommendations for optimizing your Azure resources but does not track resource deployment events. Then Azure Analysis Service is a data modeling and analytics service not meant for tracking resource management events. And the final option, Azure Monitor Action Groups, triggers notifications or actions based on Azure Monitor alerts, but they don't track resource deployments. So folks, if you are liking the content, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe the channel. Let's look at question number 40 of the series. You have an Azure App Service web app that uses a system-assigned managed identity. You need to recommend a solution to store the settings of the web app as secrets in an Azure Key Vault. The solution must meet the following requirements: minimize changes to the app code, use the principle of least privilege. What should you include in the recommendation? And the first part of the question is talking about Key Vault integration method. And your options are Key Vault references in application settings, Key Vault references in app settings.json, Key Vault references in web.config, Key Vault SDK. And folks, you should use Key Vault references in application settings. This method allows you to reference Key Vault secrets directly in the Azure App Service application settings, avoiding the need of code changes, which is one of the requirements. The secrets are injected as environment variables into the app, minimizing changes to the code and keeping things secure. You only need to update the application settings of the app service in the Azure portal by referencing the Azure Key Vault secret URI. No changes to app settings or web.config are required in this case. Now, the next part of the question is Key Vault permissions for the managed identity. And your options are get permission on keys, list and get permission on keys, get permissions on secrets, list and get permissions on secret. Following the principle of least privilege, you should be granting the get permissions for secrets. This ensures that the app can read the secrets but not list or manage them. Question specifically says to save the settings as secret. So option A and option B, which are related to keys, are automatically incorrect. Next question, friends. You have an Azure subscription. The subscription contains a tiered app named EP1 that is distributed across multiple containers hosted in Azure container instances. You need to deploy an Azure Monitor monitoring solution for app. The solution must meet the following requirements: support using synthetic transaction monitoring to monitor traffic between the EP1 components, minimize development effort. What should you include in the solution? Your options are network insights, application insights, container insights, log analytics, workspace insights. Folks, you should include application insights in your recommendation. Application insights provide synthetic transaction monitoring through its availability tests. These tests can simulate user interactions or monitor traffic between app components to ensure that each service is available and responding correctly. Azure Container Instances support built-in integration with application insights to automatically monitor container performance, telemetry, and dependencies. Now, folks, let's understand why other options are incorrect. Network Insights is primarily used for monitoring network health, performance, and traffic flows. Container Insights is used for monitoring the health and performance of containerized workloads, which is CPU memory. Log Analytics Workspace Insights allow you to centralize logs and analyze them across resources. So folks, I hope you now understand why Application Insights, which is option B, has been chosen as the correct answer in this case. Question number 42. You have 12 Azure subscriptions and 3 projects. Each project uses resources across multiple subscriptions. You need to use Microsoft Cost Management to monitor costs on a per project basis. The solution must minimize administrative effort. Which 2 components should you include in the solution? Your options are budgets, resource tags, custom role-based access control, which is RBAC roles, management groups, Azure boards. Folks, the 2 key components you should include are budgets and resource tags. Now, budgets in Microsoft Cost Management enable you to set spending limits and track costs against those limits. You can create separate budgets for each project and monitor the cost trends, helping you manage projects based cost effectively. Resource tags allow you to categorize and organize Azure resources across multiple subscriptions by applying custom metadata like project name, environment, and so on to resources. This is ideal for tracking and monitoring costs based on specific projects. Now, as always, let's understand why other options are not applicable here. Custom RBAC roles can be used for managing permissions. They are not directly related to cost monitoring. Azure management groups provide a level of scope above subscriptions. You organize subscriptions into containers called management groups and apply your governance conditions to the management groups. And Azure boards are part of Azure DevOps for work item tracking and project management. You have an on-premise network that uses an IP address space of 172.16.0.0 with a prefix of 16. You plan to deploy 30 virtual machines to a new Azure subscription. You identify the following technical requirements. All Azure virtual machines must be placed on the same subnet named subnet 1. All the Azure virtual machines must be able to communicate with all on-premise servers. The servers must be able to communicate between the on-premise network and Azure by using a site-to-site VPN. You need to recommend a subnet design that meets the technical requirements. What should you include in the recommendation? Now, to answer, you need to select the appropriate network address to the correct subnets. Each network address may be used once, more than once, or not at all. And the network addresses are 172.16.0.0 with the prefix length of 16, 172.16.1.0 with a prefix length of 27, 192.168.0.0 with a prefix length of 24, and 192.168.1.0 with a prefix length of 27. You need to tell which network address should be used for subnet 1 and gateway subnet. Folks, you don't really need in-depth networking knowledge to answer such type of questions. First key thing you need to take into consideration while answering this question is you cannot have overlapping IP addresses between on-premise and Azure virtual machines. So you can rule out both network IP addresses containing 172.16 in it, as that would overlap with on-premise address range of 172.16.0.0 with a prefix length of 16. Now you need to deploy a total of 30 virtual machines, and the first remaining CIDR range with prefix of 24 will have 256 IP addresses and second one will have 32 IP addresses. Now friends, remember Azure reserves 5 IP addresses in each range for internal purposes, which leaves us with only 27 IP addresses in the CIDR with 27 prefix. That means the correct answer for subnet will be 192.168.0.0 with a prefix of 24. Now friends, the gateway subnet would be 192.168.1.0 with a prefix of 27. Because it ensures that the gateway subnet is separate from the Azure VM subnet, which is subnet 1, and also does not overlap with the on-premise IP address space. Next question. You are designing an application that will use Azure virtual machines to analyze video files. The files will be uploaded from corporate offices that connect to Azure by using ExpressRoute. You plan to provision an Azure storage account to host the files. You need to ensure that the storage account meets the following requirements. Supports video files of up to 7 TB, provides the highest availability possible, ensures that storage is optimized for the large video files, ensures that files from the on-premise network are uploaded by using ExpressRoute. How should you configure the storage account? And the first part of the question focuses on choosing the storage account type. Your options are premium file shares, premium page blobs, standard general purpose version 2. Now friends, whenever you want to store video files, then always look for block blobs, and the two storage that support block blobs are premium page blobs and standard general purpose V2. Now friends, question specifically focuses on providing the highest availability possible. So you will have to go with general purpose V2 storage, as premium page blobs do not support GRS. And the next part of the question talks about the type of data redundancy that you'll have to choose. Your options are zone redundant storage, locally redundant storage, and geo-redundant storage. Now folks, following on from the previous explanation, redundancy type you will choose here is geo-redundant storage, as it offers the highest availability and durability by replicating data to a secondary region. Now the final part of the question talks about networking. Your options are Azure route server, a private endpoint, a service endpoint. And folks, you will have to choose a private endpoint here, as it ensures secure and direct connectivity to the storage account over ExpressRoute. Let's understand why other options are incorrect. Now, Azure Route Server is primarily designed to facilitate dynamic routing between the virtual network appliances and virtual networks. It makes integration easier for network virtual appliances such as firewalls or routers by using the border gateway protocol. Service endpoints extend your VNet's private address space to Azure services over Microsoft's backbone, thereby providing secure access. They enable you to use your virtual network's private IP to connect to Azure services like Azure Storage. Service endpoints ensure traffic to Azure services goes over Microsoft backbone, but do not guarantee integration with ExpressRoute. They will route traffic over the internet unless there is a specific ExpressRoute integration defined. Let's look at question number 45. You have 100 Microsoft SQL Server Integration Services, which is SSIS packages that are configured to use 10 on-premise SQL Server databases as their destination. You plan to migrate the 10 on-premise databases to Azure SQL database. You need to recommend a solution to create Azure SQL Server Integration Services packages. The solution must ensure that the packages can target the SQL database instances as their destinations. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Data Migration Assistant, Azure Data Catalog, SQL Server Migration Assistant, Azure Data Factory. Folks, DMA is primarily used to assess and migrate on-premise database to Azure SQL databases or SQL Server in Azure VMs. It does not handle SSIS package migration or execution, so an incorrect choice. Now, the next one is Azure Data Catalog, which is a metadata management tool that helps organizations to register, discover, and understand data sources, and in no way execute or manage SSIS packages, so another incorrect option. Now, SQL Server Migration Assistant is typically used to migrate data from other databases, which is like Oracle, MySQL to SQL Server or Azure SQL database. It's again not designed to migrate or execute SSIS packages, which leaves us with the fourth and final option. That is the correct choice here. Azure Data Factory provides Azure SSIS integration runtime that allows you to lift and shift your existing SSIS packages to Azure. You can run your SSIS packages in the cloud with minimal changes, allowing them to target Azure SQL database instance as destinations. Now refer to the link on your screen to understand more about this. Next question. You have a Microsoft Entra tenant that syncs with an on-premise Active Directory domain. Your company has a line of business application that was developed internally. You need to implement SAML single sign-on and enforce multi-factor authentication when users attempt to access the application from an unknown location. Which two features should you include in the solution? Your options are Microsoft Entra Privileged Identity Management, Azure Application Gateway, Microsoft Entra Enterprise Applications, Microsoft Entra ID Protection, Conditional Access Policies. Folks, you should use the combination of Entra Enterprise Applications and Conditional Access Policies to implement the given requirement. Now, Microsoft Entra Enterprise Applications is used to configure single sign-on for SaaS and custom applications, including those using SAML for authentication. And conditional access policies allow you to enforce conditions such as requiring multi-factor authentication when accessing resources. You can define a policy to enforce MFA when users are accessing the application from an unknown or untrusted location, ensuring higher security. Question number 47. You have an Azure subscription. You need to recommend a solution to provide developers with the ability to provision Azure virtual machines. The solution must meet the following requirements: only allow the creation of the virtual machines in specific regions, only allow the creation of specific sizes of virtual machines. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are attribute-based access control, Azure policy, conditional access policies, role-based access control. Folks, this is one of the easiest questions from AZ-305 exam perspective, as anyone who knows the basic of Azure should be able to answer this question straight away. You will use Azure policies in this case. Let's head to Azure portal and understand the two policies that you can use to implement the given requirement. So friends, we are now in Azure portal in the policy definitions. Let's explore first policy, which is allowed locations, as that will help you in implementing the first requirement, that is only allow the creation of the virtual machines in specific regions. Now there is a policy for allowed locations for resource group. We are not going to talk about this at this stage because that is pretty much specific to resource groups. We will talk about the global one, which is allowed location. Now, if you read the description of this policy, it says this policy enables you to restrict the locations your organization can specify when deploying resources, used to enforce your geo-compliance requirements. It excludes resource group, as we have already seen that there is a separate policy to restrict the resource group creation to certain locations. So friends, this policy is global and not just limited to virtual machines. You can restrict the creation of any resource to the given locations using this policy. Now let's look at another policy which is more focused around the second requirement, which was only allow the creation of specific sizes of virtual machines. So friends, you can see there is a policy named allowed virtual machine size SKUs. If you open it, the description says the policy enables you to specify a set of virtual machine size SKUs that your organization can deploy. So this is what our question was pretty much focused on. So we already have inbuilt policies in Azure to implement both of the requirements that were in our question. And even if the policy was not there, you can always go ahead and create a custom policy. Question number 48. You plan to deploy an Azure App Service web app that will have multiple instances across multiple Azure regions. You need to recommend a load balancing service for the planned deployment. The solution must meet the following requirements. Maintain access to the app in the event of a regional outage. Support Azure Web Application Firewall. Support cookie-based affinity. Support URL routing. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Azure Front Door, Azure Traffic Manager, Azure Application Gateway, Azure Load Balancer. Folks, you should include Azure Front Door in your recommendation. Azure Front Door is a global load balancer with instant failover capabilities, so it will maintain access to the app in the event of regional outage. It supports Azure Web Application Firewall integration for security and also supports cookie-based affinity for session stickiness. It also has support for URL routing for directing traffic to different backend pools based on URL patterns. Next question, friends. You are designing a microservices architecture that will support a web application. The solution must meet the following requirements. Deploy the solution on-premise and to Azure. Support low latency and hyperscale operations. Allow independent upgrades to each microservice. Set policies for performing automatic repairs to the microservices. You need to recommend a technology. What should you recommend? Your options are Azure Container Instance, Azure Logic App, Azure Service Fabric, Azure Virtual Machine Scale Set. And folks, you should include Azure Service Fabric in the recommendation. Now, Azure Service Fabric is a distributed systems platform that makes it easy to package, deploy, and manage scalable and reliable microservices and containers. It supports deployment to both on-premise and to Azure, providing a consistent platform for managing and deploying microservices. It enables low latency and hyperscale operations as it is designed for building scalable and reliable applications. It allows independent upgrades to each microservice as it supports versioning and rolling upgrades. It also provides built-in health monitoring and automatic repairs for the microservices with configurable policies. 50th question of the series. You plan to automate the deployment of resources to Azure subscription. What is the difference between using Azure Blueprints and Azure Resource Manager templates? Your options are ARM templates remain connected to the deployed resources. Only blueprints can contain policy definitions. Only ARM templates can contain policy definitions. Blueprint remain connected to the deployed resources. Folks, the blueprint preserves the relationship between the deployed application and the blueprint components. Whereas in the case of the ARM template, there remains no active relationship between your deployed application and template. This connection helps in tracking and auditing the resources. Folks, there is a link on your screen. Go through the link to understand more about the differences between the ARM templates and blueprints. So folks, that's all for this part of the series. If you have liked the content, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe the channel. I'll be back soon with more such questions in our AZ-305 exam practice question series, friends.